In this video, I'll show you a watercolor study that I painted during my lesson. At the same time, I'm explaining some basic foundational knowledge to the student. After I've sketched it out, I do the main washes of the lightest areas. Layered classical watercolor builds details, tone, and color. In some cases, you can fill in with one solid wash, like filling the whole teapot with blue, and in other cases, you can and should introduce shades right during the first wash. We're working with classical academic techniques, meaning this is layered classical watercolor, where we'll build up details and tone. Details, tone, and color as we layer. In the first layers, it's barely visible. We can outline where the shadows are and where the highlights are, and that gives us a clear understanding. In the next layers, we can clarify this a bit. In what situations can't you fill the entire object with one color? For example, if you have an orange object like a tangerine, doesn't matter, any orange on a blue background. You'll get bright violet reflections on the tangerine from the blue background. You can't apply them afterward because if you first fill everything with orange and then try to go over the shadows and reflections with blue or purple, the color will end up looking dirty and brown. If we want to depict a purple reflection on an orange object from the blue, it will warm up, so it definitely won't be blue, it will most likely be purple. First, we need to fill in the color of the highlight, create a base layer. The highlights here aren't white either in this still life. I've covered them all with a thin layer. Then immediately blend a purple base into the shadow. Because if, as I mentioned, you do the opposite and cover everything with orange right away, it will turn into a mess. Cover the light area in the wash with the lightest color on that object. This is something you figure out through experience, of course, in many cases. If you do the wash for the reflections right away, you won't have that problem at all.
Hey friends, if you like my videos and want to see more of them, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. Don't forget about the bell, and of course, leave your comments down below this video.
I have a pretty bright still life here chosen by my student. There are a lot of details, several objects, and as you know, my lesson lasts 45 minutes. Besides painting studies, I also spend a lot of time at the beginning of the lesson discussing the homework, what to do with it, and where to go next. Only after that did I start painting this study. I honestly admit that I didn't finish it in this 45-minute lesson. After the lesson, I continued for about 20 more minutes, and I also held the lesson longer than usual, by about 10 minutes for sure. In painting, we have two main principles, warm and cool. If anyone doesn't know them, I'll repeat them once more. If the light is cool, then the shadow will be warm and warmer than the light. If the light is warm, then the shadow will definitely be cool, cooler than the light. Here I have this double lighting. Actually, some light was coming in from the window, and there's a lamp with almost neutral lighting, but it still has a warm tint. So my shadows will have a bit of a blue inclination, let's say. When I start with the first layers, as I mentioned, I fill in the lightest areas first, meaning I begin with the brightest parts. And the shadows, you saw that I started with the shadows. Why is this convenient? Because I want to make the shadows even and smooth, so that it actually looks like a shadow and not just a blob where the teapot or lemon is sitting. It's easier to layer the shadows right away. How do you do this on watercolor paper? I'm told that you can't do washes on watercolor paper. That's exactly why I love it, because you can layer it endlessly. I have a lot of pieces here, and I'm definitely doing about 6 layers, maybe even more. You can also glaze on it. For example, I'll paint a detail on the lemon, then I'll see that it needs to be darker, and I can glaze over it completely without losing any details in the process.
If you want to learn how to draw like a professional artist, I have some great news for you. The best drawing tutorial, which is already being sold in dozens of countries, is now available in English. This is a complete drawing course that takes you from the basics all the way to advanced pencil portraits. It includes plastic anatomy for all parts of the face and head. There's a detailed guide on how to shade correctly. You'll learn how to depict volume and how to light your objects in the drawing from your imagination, how to make sketches from life and make them look realistic. You'll be able to draw different objects and, of course, people. But at the end of the tutorial, you'll learn how to draw people of different ages from life and make them look like themselves.
You can create smooth shadows in several ways. One way is, like in the classics, to slightly dampen the paper, after which we start introducing the tone of the shadow. Where do we start? We start with the lightest tone of the shadow and color because, as you can see, the color also changes depending on the location. Shadows are just as colorful as the objects. A shadow isn't just a little brown or black paint. It has its own color. For example, the shadow near the lemon has a reddish-orange tint, while closer to the teapot, it has a more bluish tint because the reflection from the blue teapot also falls onto the shadow. So, we start by applying the lightest shadow first, Then I add watercolor in strokes, as if I'm shading, if it's not a wash, of course, although my washes also have movements that look like I'm shading. Then we move closer to the dark, meaning towards the center, a little darker, then a little darker again, and a little darker still. And this way, we layer, 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 deepening the shadow. The only thing is, to avoid ruining the paper, I don't recommend going over it wet too many times. So, for example, you made a wet wash, added a little darkness to the shadow, then let it dry, and then you can go back and add more strokes to it. Another way is to do it dry. So, as I just explained about doing it wet, another way is to gradually build up those dark tones dry. You started with a light wash, then stepped back, went a bit darker, stepped back again, and made it even darker. This way you get a gradient and the feeling that it's a falling shadow, not just some blob. I've never tried masking fluid. It leaves rough edges, but you can paint over them. I left highlights white, though they're colored. The only thing is it doesn't leave very precise edges. But that's not a big deal. You can always touch it up. So if you want, you can just buy some masking fluid, cover those highlights, and then you can glaze right over it, covering the whole lemon slice. I didn't have it, so I just left all the highlights white in the classic way, even though they're not really white. They're the color of the highlight, meaning both the lemon and the highlights on the teapot. I covered them all with some color. Then I start by painting it lighter. All my watercolors, just like my classic drawings, move from light to dark. So I start with everything being lighter. I gather everything and paint the whole still life at once. After that it gets a little darker, then a little darker again, and a little darker still. So with each layer I make it denser. Why is this important? In the first layer I can check my painting. If it's wrong, I can wash it off. If I have something wrong, I can fix it without much loss. I can wash it off and either just write on top. But if I go straight in with full color and tone, it'll be much harder to correct anything. At the beginning of the work, when I'm doing large washes, the first layers, I use a big brush and a lot of water. But then, as I get closer to the details, the more precise I try to be, the smaller my brush gets and the less water I use. Although in reality, if you use a round brush, you can do everything with it. A round brush with a fine tip, because I pretty much painted the whole study with just one brush. It has a fine tip, so I was able to add in the details. But if there are any, for example, clear lines, then you can definitely use a smaller brush. And at the end of the work, if I need to do a glaze, for those who don't know, glazing is a very thin layer of transparent paint that adds a tint. It's meant to not change the color, although it can change the color too, but rather to give some shade, or to tone something down if something is sticking out and not in its place, something that really catches the eye. You can glaze over it lightly. I also do the glazing with a larger brush and apply the paint in a thin layer. I'm not afraid that something will get blurred because that's a common issue with many watercolor papers. So watercolor paper is more resistant to some damage, but if you work correctly, your paper won't get damaged at all. What do I require from watercolor paper? It definitely needs to allow for layering as much as I need. The color should stay as I paint it, meaning it shouldn't fade too much, absorb too much, or become muddy. There are practically no minimal changes on the drawing paper at all. Next point, I need to be able to do glazing on it for sure, because glazing is an essential part of watercolor technique, along with washes and so on. Unfortunately, on most other papers, on all the ones I've tried, one of these points is missing. On drawing paper, I can do all of them, but it's also a matter of habit. A lot of watercolor artists who only work on watercolor paper can get used to that too. So I recommend you try different types of paper. In stores, it is possible to order samples of papers. So, don't buy expensive notebooks right away because they might not work for you. I have about 5 of those lying around. Just go to the store or buy them, or they might give you free samples of different papers from different brands and do a little sketch on each one and you'll see the difference. At the end of the video, I want to remind you, don't forget to hit the bell if you haven't done it yet, because otherwise you won't see the updates that will be on my channel, and there are a lot of interesting topics coming up. As you can see, I'm currently releasing videos consistently once a week. I also often do polls in the community section on YouTube, asking what videos you want, and I create content based on the percentage of your choices. So come in and take a look. So on Instagram, of course, first of all, everything is on Instagram regarding all questions, all updates, and exhibitions. To stay updated on the leading exhibitions, I'm currently actively participating in them. And completely different themes, from pastels to oils to everything together, including watercolor. That's why I have photo reports from different exhibitions, so you can see what's happening in the contemporary art world, But with that, I'm saying goodbye to you. I wish everyone a great mood and see you next time.